When the news first broke that Melania Trump was suing Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the political world seemed to pause for a moment. Lawsuits from public figures weren't new, but this one felt unusual, personal, and bold. People who had followed Melania's years in the public eye knew she wasn't someone who often jumped into public disputes directly. Her demeanor had been one of composure, of carefully chosen appearances, and of a certain deliberate silence when others might have spoken out. Yet here she was, stepping into a courtroom against a sitting congresswoman. It was not just a legal maneuver, it was a declaration that her name, her reputation, and her legacy were being threatened. The filing itself made waves because of the way it was framed. It wasn't positioned as political retaliation, at least not publicly. Instead, it was built on the idea of dignity. Melania Trump versus a political figure who, according to the lawsuit, had unfairly smeared her character. Her attorneys spoke about her as a woman who had been maligned in the court of public opinion, someone who had endured accusations and ridicule that she no longer wished to tolerate. This was supposed to be the line she would not allow to be crossed. Commentators quickly speculated about the motives. Was this about repairing her image as much as it was about punishing Jasmine Crockett? Some believed it was her attempt to show that she would not remain silent forever, that her voice could cut through the noise. Others suggested it was less about Crockett and more about sending a message to anyone who thought she was an easy target. Whatever the interpretation, the legal action made her the center of a narrative that had less to do with politics and more to do with pride. Court documents detailed the statements Melania claimed were damaging, and as they were dissected on television panels and in newspapers, the discussion turned to her legacy. For years, she had been portrayed in conflicting ways, sometimes as the elegant and reserved former First Lady, other times as a figure criticized for her silence on controversies that swirled around her husband. This lawsuit, however, shifted the lens entirely onto her. It was Melania, not Donald Trump, who had taken a step into the spotlight of confrontation. She was not the supporting figure here. She was the lead. When she walked into the courtroom for the first hearing, her posture and expression carried the same guarded confidence that people recognized from her public appearances as First Lady. Reporters described her as composed, her face unreadable, her presence almost calculated to convey strength without aggression. She wanted the world to see a woman defending herself, not lashing out. And still, in the background, the constant mention of her husband lingered. Donald Trump's name appeared in every headline, as if the lawsuit could not be discussed without him. He was not a party in the case. But the shadow of his political wars and legal battles colored how people interpreted her own. Some asked quietly if this lawsuit was truly hers alone, or if it was another chapter in the larger Trump narrative of combat, defense, and image management. In interviews, legal experts debated the strategy of the filing. They pointed out that defamation lawsuits were notoriously difficult to win for public figures. The burden of proof was heavy, requiring Melania to show not only that Crockett's statements were false, but also that they had been made with actual malice. That high bar made observers wonder why she had taken the risk. To some, the answer was simple. It wasn't about winning or losing in the courtroom. It was about the theater of the act itself. By suing, she created the impression of strength, of someone unwilling to be trampled upon. The attention was immediate and intense. Social media flared up, supporters rallying behind her with claims that she had endured years of insults. While critics argued that the lawsuit was an overreaction, the polarization mirrored the broader divides of the country, with her name once again tied to political fault lines. Yet even in the noise, her decision to sue Crockett was recognized as a bold and unexpected move. As the first days of legal proceedings unfolded, it was clear that Melania wanted this lawsuit to be remembered as the moment she drew her own line in the sand. Her team portrayed her as a woman, reclaiming control of her public image. For her, the courtroom was not just a place of legal argument, it was a stage where she could attempt to rewrite the narrative that had so often been shaped by others. Whether people believed in the strength of her case or not, her action made one thing undeniable. Melania Trump had decided that silence was no longer enough. Do you want me to move forward and expand Keynote 2 into 700 words the same way? Continuing the story flow? When the lawsuit against Jasmine Crockett moved into the courtroom, it quickly became clear that Melania Trump's legal team had built their approach on a careful strategy. They knew the risks of putting a former First Lady in the middle of such a public fight, so their entire presentation was designed to project one simple message. Melania was not acting out of spite but out of necessity. Her attorneys painted her as a woman who had endured years of commentary and innuendo without striking back. A woman who had been mocked and criticized in ways no one else could truly understand, and yet had carried herself with composure. This case, they argued, was not political theater, it was a defense of her dignity. The strategy leaned heavily on reframing the perception of Melania, rather than allowing her to be viewed as a supporting figure in the shadow of her husband, Donald Trump. Her team wanted her seen as an independent woman, capable of standing up for herself. The courtroom atmosphere reflected this calculated presentation. Every word was chosen with precision, every statement crafted to elevate her above the partisan fray. Her lawyers avoided grand displays of anger. Instead, they spoke with quiet conviction, arguing that Crockett's remarks had not just been careless, but cruel, cutting into the core of Melania's reputation. To the public watching from the outside, it felt as if the case was less about the law and more about shaping a story. Reporters covering the proceedings noted how her team repeated phrases like personal integrity and respect, signaling that they were not chasing money but recognition. They wanted the court and the world to understand that Melania was demanding acknowledgement of the harm done to her. This aligned with the image she had carried throughout her time as First Lady: distant, elegant, and often misunderstood. But no matter how much her attorneys tried to center the narrative around her, Donald Trump's presence hung over the proceedings. His name surfaced constantly, whether in the media commentary or the cross-examinations. It was impossible to separate her from him entirely. Some critics openly suggested that this lawsuit carried his fingerprints, that it echoed his own history of suing those who spoke against him. Supporters, however, saw it differently. They argued that she was proving herself more than just his wife, that she was showing she could command the stage without him speaking for her. Even so, the connection was undeniable, and the strategy had to account for that shadow. Inside the courtroom, the strategy seemed to be working, at least at first. Her attorneys laid out their arguments with methodical patience, painting Crockett's words as reckless and harmful. They pointed out how easily such remarks could shape public perception in the age of viral headlines and social media amplification. The jurors were reminded again and again that reputations could be broken in an instant, and that Melania's name carried weight not just for her, but for her family. The implication was subtle but effective. If her image was left unprotected, it could ripple outward, affecting even Donald Trump's legacy and future. Every detail of her presentation was deliberate. When Melania sat in the courtroom, she did not frown or roll her eyes at the arguments made against her. She remained still, composed, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze steady. Reporters described her demeanor as almost statuesque, reminder that she was not there to perform but to endure. That stoicism played directly into her team's strategy. They wanted the public to see her as dignified in the face of insult, a woman who chose law over loud retaliation. Legal experts watching the case debated whether this approach would succeed. Some admired the restraint, saying it gave her credibility, while others argued that it made her seem detached, unwilling to show vulnerability. But whether admired or criticized, the strategy kept her firmly at the center of attention. She was no longer a silent figure trailing in her husband's controversies. She was a litigant in her own right, commanding headlines through her own decisions. The emphasis on dignity resonated with a portion of the public who felt she had been unfairly caricatured for years. In their eyes, this lawsuit was overdue. It was a moment where Melania Trump stood up for herself, not as an extension of Donald, but as an individual who had reached her limit. Yet in the same breath, others saw the strategy as fragile, built on the assumption that the courtroom would treat her story with the same sympathy her lawyers crafted. It was a gamble, one that placed her image on the line in a way it had never been tested before. The longer the case went on, the clearer it became that her legal team had invested everything into controlling the narrative. They wanted jurors, reporters, and the public to walk away believing that this was a woman reclaiming control, not a former First Lady entangled in pettiness. The strategy was carefully calculated, but as the proceedings moved forward, observers began to wonder if this polished presentation could withstand the unexpected turns that courtrooms are known for. The plan was built on order and precision, but all it would take was one crack in the foundation for everything to come undone. You want me to continue with Keynote 3 expansion, in 700 words, where the witness moment happens? The day the witness was called to the stand began like any other in the courtroom, but there was a noticeable shift in energy. Melania Trump's legal team had prepared for this moment with meticulous care. This was supposed to be the centerpiece of their strategy, the testimony that would validate her claims and drive home the point that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's words had inflicted real harm. The room was filled with the usual mix of reporters, attorneys, and observers, each one anticipating how the testimony would shape the case. Even Melania herself sat slightly more upright, her expression unchanged, but her posture betraying the quiet weight of expectation. The witness was meant to be a reinforcement of everything her lawyers had argued. They had promised the court that this testimony would demonstrate how her reputation had been unfairly dragged, how the public perception of her had been twisted by Crockett's remarks. For a few minutes, it appeared to be going according to plan. The direct examination unfolded smoothly, with the witness confirming details about Melania's character and the damaging effects of public commentary. The statements were simple, steady, and aligned with her legal team's strategy of painting her as a woman wronged but dignified. Then came the cross-examination. It began with a calm, measured question from Crockett's attorney, nothing confrontational, nothing unusual. Yet, in less than 9 seconds, the entire trajectory of the case shifted. The witness, perhaps too eager or perhaps caught off guard, gave an answer that directly contradicted the very foundation of Melania's lawsuit. It was not shouted or dramatized. It was spoken plainly, almost matter-of-factly, but the effect was immediate and devastating. Asterisk, the room went silent. Reporters froze mid-scribble, attorneys paused their note-taking, and even the judge seemed to lean slightly forward. Melania's lawyers quickly attempted to contain the damage, but it was too late. In those few seconds, the carefully built argument that her reputation had been deeply harmed had been undermined. What was meant to be proof of her injury instead became evidence of the fragility of her claim. Asterisk, the most striking part was Melania's reaction, or lack of one. She remained perfectly still, her face as composed as it had been throughout the trial. Some interpreted this as grace under fire, while others saw it as an inability to confront the unraveling of her own case. Donald Trump's name was immediately dragged back into the conversation, not because he was in the courtroom, but because observers compared the collapse of her legal argument to his own history of courtroom surprises. Commentators suggested that the same unpredictability that often haunted his legal battles had now touched hers, blurring the line between their individual struggles. Asterisk, for Melania, the witness's slip was more than a technical setback. It was symbolic. She had positioned the lawsuit as a matter of honor, a stand against being disrespected. But when her own side inadvertently dismantled her position, the perception shifted. Instead of being seen as a figure of dignity under attack, she began to be viewed as someone whose legacy was vulnerable, even fragile. Asterisk, the witness's words echoed outside the courtroom almost instantly. Social media erupted, clips of the exchange spreading within minutes. Headlines framed it as the moment Melania's case cracked. Pundits dissected the exact phrasing, replaying the 9 seconds that changed everything. For supporters, it was painful to watch, a betrayal of her trust in her legal team's preparation. For critics, it was confirmation that the lawsuit had been misguided from the start. Asterisk, in the aftermath of that testimony, the courtroom atmosphere shifted palpably. Crockett's team grew visibly more confident, their questions sharper, their tone more assured. Melania's attorneys, on the other hand, carried a new weight in their voices, as if aware that they were no longer steering the case, but trying to keep it from collapsing altogether. The witness who was supposed to fortify Melania's case had instead become the crack that spread across the entire structure. Asterisk, Donald Trump's name returned again in commentary as analysts debated whether this failure reflected on her as an individual or as part of the broader Trump brand. To some, it was evidence that the Trump approach to confrontation, direct, aggressive, but risky, was no longer effective in a courtroom. To others, it showed that Melania was paying the price for stepping into a fight she did not need to start. Either way, the damage was done. The 9 seconds of testimony could not be taken back, and their weight lingered over every subsequent moment of the trial. Asterisk, by the time the witness stepped down, the courtroom no longer felt like a place where Melania was in control of her narrative. The silence that followed was telling. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone realizes a turning point has been reached. She had entered the courtroom to protect her legacy, but with one misstep from her own witness, that legacy had been put in greater jeopardy than ever before. Do you want me to go ahead and expand Keynote 4 into 700 words? Showing how the legacy in the days that followed the disastrous witness testimony, the fallout was immediate and unforgiving. What had begun as a bold attempt by Melania Trump to defend her dignity and solidify her legacy had transformed into something far more complicated. Instead of leaving the courtroom with her reputation strengthened, she found herself at the center of conversations that questioned not just the validity of her lawsuit, but the very foundation of the image she had spent years curating. The narrative shifted overnight, and it was clear that the outcome was no longer about the technicalities of the case. It was about how history would remember her. Asterisk. Observers began to analyze her motives with a sharper edge. Some argued that she had taken on a battle she did not need to fight, stepping into a legal arena where the risks far outweighed the rewards. The witness's 9-second slip had left her exposed, and people wondered why someone as careful and reserved as Melania had decided to gamble with her public image in such a way. Critics suggested that her decision to sue Jasmine Crockett mirrored the combative style long associated with Donald Trump, a strategy that thrived in the political world but often faltered under the stricter rules of a courtroom. For many, the case became a reflection of him as much as it was about her, tying their legacies together even more tightly. Asterisk, the media seized on the irony. For years, Melania had managed to maintain a level of distance from her husband's political chaos, often presenting herself as separate, even aloof, from his controversies. Yet, with this lawsuit, she had stepped directly into the same cycle of confrontation that defined his public life. The collapse of her case was framed as a mirror of his own setbacks, high-profile fights that ended with more questions than victories. Commentators noted that she had wanted to stand alone, but in the end, she was once again pulled back into his orbit, her attempt at independence overshadowed by the association with his relentless battles. Asterisk, her supporters, however, tried to spin the outcome differently. They argued that the very act of filing the lawsuit was evidence of strength, proof that she would not quietly accept public attacks. They pointed to her composure throughout the proceedings, highlighting that she never broke her silence, never let frustration or anger show on her face, even when her case unraveled in front of her. To them, the courtroom defeat was secondary to the fact that she had taken a stand. But even within those circles, there was an acknowledgement that the legacy impact was undeniable. The story of Melania suing Crockett would forever include the moment her own witness undid her. Social media amplified the perception of collapse. Memes, clips, and commentary replayed the courtroom exchange endlessly, ensuring that the 9 seconds would live on in public memory. The incident became shorthand for fragility, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed image could be shattered instantly. For Melania, this was a particularly bitter reality. Her public life had always been defined by control of her words, her expressions, her appearances. Now her name was attached to a failure that was entirely out of her control. A mistake not of her own making, but one that carried her signature nonetheless. Donald Trump's presence in the aftermath was subtle but significant. His name surfaced in discussions of how the family's brand was evolving, especially as he navigated his own legal battles. Some claimed that Melania's failed lawsuit added to the perception of instability surrounding the Trump name, while others believed it highlighted her willingness to fight in her own way, independent of him. Yet the constant mention of him in connection to her case underscored how intertwined their legacies had become. No matter how much she wanted to stand apart, her actions were inevitably measured against his reputation. The true impact of the lawsuit was not the legal outcome but the cultural memory it created. It became a story less about the fine points of defamation law and more about how quickly a reputation could shift. Melania had hoped the lawsuit would protect her legacy, but instead it demonstrated how vulnerable that legacy truly was. The collapse was not dramatic in the sense of shouting or spectacle. It was quiet, precise, and devastating. It was the kind of moment that lingered, not because of theatrics, but because of its simplicity. One statement, one slip, one crack, and everything she wanted to protect slipped further out of reach. In the weeks after the trial, analysts reflected on how her image had changed. She was no longer just the silent, elegant former First Lady who kept her distance from the fray. She had become the woman whose lawsuit backfired, whose own witness turned her case against her. For someone who had spent years carefully guarding her persona, it was a legacy-altering event. And while supporters tried to highlight her resilience, and critics pointed to her miscalculation, one truth became clear. Melania Trump's attempt to control her story had instead given the world a story she would never be able to erase. Would you like me to now write the 500-word ending statement that ties all 4 keynotes together in storytelling style? When the lawsuit was first announced, it carried an air of confidence. Melania Trump was stepping into a space where she had rarely gone before, not as a quiet figure at her husband's side, but as the central actor in her own confrontation. The early coverage made it seem as if this was going to be her defining moment, an act of courage to protect her name and legacy from being diminished. Many expected a carefully orchestrated victory, a chance for her to prove she could command respect on her own terms. But what unfolded inside that courtroom told a different story, one that would become inseparable from her public memory. The foundation of her case was built on dignity, the argument that she was not simply reacting but standing firm in defense of her character. Her legal team emphasized her grace, her patience, and her restraint in the face of years of criticism. For a time, that image held steady. Reporters described her as composed, almost regal, throughout the proceedings, giving no hint of frustration or doubt. It was the kind of presentation that seemed carefully rehearsed, designed to remind everyone that she was not there for spectacle but for justice. Yet beneath the surface, the risks were greater than many realized. The turning point came in a moment no one could have scripted. Her own witness, expected to reinforce her claims, spoke words that instantly unraveled the careful narrative her team had constructed. In less than 10 seconds, the heart of her case was contradicted, leaving her exposed in a way that she could not control. The silence that followed in the courtroom was not dramatic, but it was heavy with recognition. Everyone knew what had just happened. It wasn't a minor stumble. It was the collapse of the central argument, and it had come from her own side. From that moment, the lawsuit was no longer about the finer points of defamation. It became a story about fragility, about how quickly control can slip away even from someone as deliberate and measured as Melania. The irony was hard to miss. For years, she had cultivated an image of distance and composure, someone who stood apart from the noise of politics and controversy. By filing this lawsuit, she had tried to assert herself more forcefully, but instead, she found herself tied more tightly to the cycle of confrontation and miscalculation, often associated with Donald Trump. Her attempt at independence was overshadowed by the collapse that followed, with commentators drawing comparisons to his own courtroom battles. In the aftermath, her legacy shifted. She had wanted to show strength, to protect her reputation from being diminished, but instead, the lawsuit became remembered as the moment it slipped further from her control. Supporters pointed to her composure, arguing that she had at least shown the courage to take a stand. Critics insisted it was a mistake from the beginning, a gamble that revealed more weakness than strength. Either way, the impact was undeniable. Asterisk, the ending of the story is not written in verdicts or legal documents, but in perception. Melania Trump's lawsuit against Jasmine Crockett will not be remembered for the damages she sought or the arguments her lawyers made. It will be remembered for the 9 seconds that shattered her case and reshaped her image. What she hoped would be a defining defense of her dignity, instead became a reminder of how fragile legacy can be. Even for someone who has spent a lifetime guarding it carefully. In trying to control the narrative, she gave the world a story that will outlive the lawsuit itself. Would you like me to also combine all 4 keynote expansions, plus this ending into one full, lengthy continuous story, so it flows seamlessly?